The afternoon sun was a heavy, golden blanket over the cobblestone square of the capital city. Citizens meandered between market stalls, the air thick with the scent of fresh bread, blooming flowers, and the low hum of daily life. In the center of it all, a towering statue of the late king cast a long, cooling shadow. Leaning against the base of this statue, his posture deceptively relaxed, was a royal guard named Kale. To any passerby, he was an immovable fixture of the landscape. A young man in the pristine white and gold uniform of the palace guard, his face an unreadable mask of stoic discipline. But beneath the polished breastplate and the rigidly still expression, Kale's mind was a finely tuned instrument. His eyes, a sharp and intelligent gray, continuously swept the square, cataloging faces, gates, and unusual packages. He had been a guard for 5 years, and in that time he had learned that the greatest threats were never the obvious ones. They were whispers, hidden in plain sight. His gaze drifted towards a woman struggling with a wicker basket overflowing with yarn near a fabric stall. He noted a group of young nobles laughing a little too loudly outside a tavern. He saw a scruffy dog trot across the square with a stolen sausage in its mouth, causing a ripple of laughter. And then, his eyes landed on a sight that was both common and, on this particular day, strangely discordant. A little girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, he was walking through the crowd with a small basket of wildflowers. She had mousy brown hair pulled back in a simple tie and wore a faded but clean blue dress. She was the picture of innocence. But as she moved, Kale saw something that pricked at his subconscious. She wasn't looking at the flowers, or the stalls, or the other children. Her gaze was too steady, too purposeful, and it was aimed directly at the palace. She would stop at intervals, and bend down as if to retie the lace on her worn leather shoe, and her small hand would dart out. With a swift, practiced motion, she would pluck a single flower from her basket and drop it onto the ground. Not in a gutter or a shadowy corner, but right in the middle of the clean, sunlit cobblestones. Kyle's interest, a purely professional one, was now fully engaged. He watched her trace a path through the crowd, a trail of colorful blossoms, a red poppy here, a blue cornflower there. See a white daisy a few paces later. It looked like a game, a trail of breadcrumbs for a fairy. But Kyle's training screamed that it was something else. It was a signal. He shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, his gaze now locked on the girl. He saw her hesitate near a fountain. She glanced around, her expression that of a lost child. But her eyes, when they swept past him, held a flicker of something else. Not fear, but a deep, profound weariness. It was the look of someone carrying a burden far too heavy for their small frame. That look solidified Kale's suspicion. This was no game. The girl moved on, and her path led her directly towards the wide, manicured promenade that bordered the palace walls. This was a restricted area. Commoners were not permitted past the ornate iron fence that lined the promenade. A pair of guards, men Kale knew, stood at the main gate, their expressions bored but their posture alert. The little girl, and still clutching her now half-empty basket, approached the fence. She stopped right in front of it, her small hands wrapping around the cold iron bars. From his position 100 yards away, Kyle watched. He saw one of the gate guards shift his weight, ready to shoo her away. But before he could, the little girl's face crumpled. A single loud sob escaped her lips. She began to cry, not the theatrical tears of a child trying to get her way, but the gut-wrenching, the hopeless sobs of someone utterly terrified. The guard, a man named Rickard with a soft spot for children, hesitated. He took a step towards her. Now, little one," he said, his voice gentler than protocol dictated. "You can't be here. Where's your mother?" The girl just shook her head, tears streaming down her face. She pointed a trembling finger down the promenade, away from the gate. Through the sobs, she choked out words that Kyle, with his keen hearing, could just barely catch. The nice lady. She gave me a penny for flowers. And then, a bad man. He took her down there. This was it, the performance. Rickard's partner, a stricter man named Vance, immediately became alert. Rickard, don't. It could be a trick. But Rickard, swayed by the child's evident distress, took another step. A trick from a crying child? Look at her, Vance. She's terrified. He knelt down. A bad man? Where, sweetheart? Show me. The little girl, still crying, pointed again. More emphatically this time, down the long, tree-lined promenade. As she did, her other hand, the one not pointing, did something incredibly subtle. She had been holding her flower basket against the fence. Now she let it slip from her grasp. It tumbled to the ground, spilling its remaining contents, a small pile of white daisies right at the base of the fence. Rickard was already looking down the promenade, his attention captured by her pointing. And Vance was scanning the crowd for potential threats. But Cale, watching from afar, saw the whole picture. The pointed finger was the distraction. The spilled flowers were the message. The poppies, cornflowers, and daisies she had dropped weren't random. They were a coded sequence. It was an old, pre-crowned signal system used by the underground messengers before the current king's reign, a system Cale's father, a former intelligence officer, had taught him as a boy, more as a piece of historical trivia than anything practical. Red for danger, blue for authority, white for immediate. The pattern in which they were dropped created a specific warning. Danger to the crown. Capture imminent. Act now. Rickard, oblivious, was now speaking gently to the girl. I can't leave my post, little one, but I can send for a city watchman. He can help you find your mother. The girl's crying hitched, a flicker of despair crossing her face. The plan was failing, and the guard wasn't following. He was being kind, but he was sticking to the rules. This was the moment Cale had to make a choice that could end his career. The Royal Guard had one unbreakable rule. Never leave your designated post without a direct order from a superior. To do so was dereliction of duty, punishable by imprisonment. He was the human embodiment of the palace's first line of defense, an unmoving statue of law and order. But as he watched the little girl's act of desperate, ingenious bravery, he saw the truth. The rules were designed to protect the crown, but right now, the rules were the very thing preventing him from doing exactly that. He made his decision. Pushing off from the statue, Cale began to walk. He didn't run. Running would cause alarm. He moved with a purposeful, unhurried stride that ate up the distance between his post at the statue and the gate on the promenade. As he approached, Vance saw him first. "Guard Cale," Vance said, his voice laced with confusion. "You are away from your post." Kyle ignored him, his eyes fixed on the little girl. Her tear-streaked face turned towards him, and in her eyes, he saw a flicker of pure terror. She thought she was being arrested. She thought she had failed. Cale knelt down, bringing himself to her level. He didn't offer her a kind smile. His expression was as serious as hers. He spoke in a low, calm voice, meant only for her. "I saw the flowers. Red, blue, white. I understand." The change in the girl was instantaneous. The trembling stopped. The sobs ceased as if a switch had been flipped. She stared at him, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and dawning hope. "Who?" Kyle asked, his voice still low. The girl swallowed, her voice a tiny, shaky whisper. "The Queen's lady. Mistress Ilara. She was in the garden this morning picking flowers for the nursery. A man. He came from behind the hedge. He had a cloth. He put it over her face." Or she dropped her basket. Before she went to sleep, she saw me. She looked right at me, and she nodded her head towards the old well. The Old Well. It was a disused structure on the far edge of the palace grounds, a place shrouded by overgrown hedges and old oak trees. It was the perfect spot for a clandestine meeting, or a kidnapping. "Why you?" Kyle asked, his mind racing. "She's my sister," the girl whispered, a fresh tear sliding down her cheek. "She told me, if anything ever happened, to leave a flower trail for the guards who knew. She said there were still a few who would remember the old ways. I didn't know if it was true." Kyle placed a hand gently on her small shoulder. It was true. He stood up and turned to face Ricard and Vance, whose faces were a mixture of confusion and alarm. "Vance," Kyle said, his voice now carrying the full authority of a guardsman who had made up his mind. "Send a runner to the captain of the guard. Tell him a threat has been identified near the old well on the grounds. Tell him to secure the area quietly and immediately." Vance stared, his mouth opening and closing. "But, Cale, your post, the rules. You can't just—" "The rules are made to serve the crown, Vance," Cale interrupted, his gray eyes like steel. "Not the other way around. A member of the Queen's household has been taken. Every second we stand here debating is a second we lose. Do it. And now." The sheer force of Cale's conviction broke through Vance's hesitation. He nodded sharply and turned to a young page boy hovering near the gate, sending him sprinting towards the main barracks. Cale looked down at the girl. "Can you walk? Can you show me exactly where you saw this happen?" She nodded, her small hand reaching out and gripping the edge of his white and gold tunic. Together they moved past the gate, onto the sacred restricted grounds of the palace. Ricard watched them go, his face pale. He knew Cale had just broken the most fundamental law of their order. He also knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that Cale was right. They moved quickly through the palace gardens, a surreal pair. The tall, imposing guard in his pristine uniform, and the small, scruffy girl in the faded blue dress clinging to his side. She led him past the rose bushes and the ornamental fountains towards a wilder, less manicured part of the grounds. The ancient oak trees grew thick here, their branches blocking out the sun, and there, in a small clearing, stood the old stone well, half covered in moss and ivy. Kyle held a finger to his lips, pulling the girl behind the thick trunk of an oak. He peered around it. The clearing was silent, too silent. The birds that had been singing in the other parts of the garden were absent here. Then he heard it. A low, muffled sound. A moan. It was coming from the well. He saw them then. Two men, dressed in the dark. In nondescript clothing of common laborers, were standing near the well's stone lip. They were arguing in hushed, frantic tones. One was pacing, the other was gesturing angrily. "The boat won't wait forever," the pacer hissed. "Then we go now. We throw her in the river, problem solved," the other spat back. Cale's blood ran cold. They were going to kill her. He had no weapon other than the short sword at his belt and his own wits. He couldn't wait for reinforcements. He had to act. Then he looked down at the girl. Her face was white as a sheet, but her jaw was set with a determination that humbled him. "Stay here," he whispered. "No matter what you hear, do not move. Do you understand?" She nodded, her small fingers digging into the bark of the tree. Kyle took a deep breath, centering himself. He wasn't just breaking the rules anymore. He was about to walk into a fight with two desperate men, alone. He stepped out from behind the tree. "You there!" he called out, his voice sharp and clear in the quiet glade. "Step away from the well!" The two men whirled around, their faces contorting with shock and then rage. The pacer's hand went to his belt, pulling out a long, wicked-looking knife. "It's just one guard!" the other man snarled. "Get him!" they charged. Kyle didn't wait for them. He met them head-on. The first man swung the knife in a wild arc. Kyle sidestepped, using the man's momentum to shove him hard into the stone well. And there was a sickening thud as his head connected with the rock, and he crumpled to the ground, unconscious. The second man was bigger, slower, but stronger. He lunged at Cale, wrapping his arms around him in a bear hug, trying to crush him. Cale drove his knee up into the man's stomach once, twice. The grip loosened. Cale brought the hilt of his sword down on the back of the man's neck. The big man grunted and fell forward, landing in a heap on the mossy ground. Cale stood over them, in his breath ragged, his uniform smudged with dirt. The whole fight had lasted less than 20 seconds. He rushed to the well and peered over the edge. It wasn't a deep well, more of a dry cistern. At the bottom, slumped against the damp stone wall, was a woman in a fine linen dress. Mistress Elara. Her hands were bound, and a gag was in her mouth, but her eyes were open. They were wide with fear, but when she saw the white and gold uniform above her, they filled with tears of relief. "It's all right," Kyle called down. "You're safe now. The guard is here." At that moment, the sound of multiple boots thudding on the garden path reached his ears. Vance had been efficient. A squad of a dozen royal guards, led by the captain himself, burst into the clearing, their swords drawn. They skidded to a halt, taking in the scene. The two unconscious men, the disheveled Cale standing by the well, and then, emerging from behind the oak tree, a small, frightened girl in a blue dress. And the captain, a grizzled veteran named Theron, stared at Kyle. His eyes took in everything: Cale's absence from his post, his disheveled state, the two incapacitated men. The silence was deafening. "Guardsman Cale!" Captain Theron's voice was cold and hard. "Explain yourself. You have abandoned your post." Kyle stood at attention, his face betraying no emotion. "Yes, sir, I did." Before he could say another word, the little girl stepped forward. She walked right up to the formidable captain and looked up at him, her small voice clear as a bell in the silent glade. "He's not a rule breaker," she said. "He's a hero. He saved my sister." She pointed to the well. "He understood the flowers. The red for danger, the blue for the palace, the white for now. My sister taught me. She said the good guards would remember." Captain Theron's hard gaze shifted from Cale to the girl, and then to the well where Elara was now being carefully pulled to safety by two of his men. He saw the terror and gratitude on her face. He looked back at Kyle, and a slow, almost imperceptible change came over his stern features. It wasn't a smile, but it was an acknowledgement. He turned to his men. "Secure the prisoners. Get a healer for the Lady Elara." He then looked directly at Cale. "Guardsman Cale, you will accompany me to the palace. A full report is required." As Cale fell into step behind his captain, he felt a small hand slip into his. The little girl walked beside him, her grip tight. She didn't say a word, but she didn't have to. In the grand marble corridors of the palace, where rules were iron and protocol was king, one small, brave girl and one rule-breaking guard had proven that the greatest duty was not to the letter of the law, but to the spirit of protection it was meant to serve. And the hidden signal had been delivered, and in breaking the rules, Cale had upheld the very essence of his oath.